Good morning, and good morning, Professor Fukuyama. It's a great honor to have you with us today. Martin Wolf yesterday said he had been stealing some of your ideas for his columns, and I think we've all been stealing a lot of your ideas and writings for our columns all over Europe and probably in your country too. So thank you very much for all of your work. And so we're going to explore some of it today together. You recently wrote about the 100 days of Trump in the White House, the first 100 days. And you, you said that today psychology is more is better suited to the analysis than political science. And you pointed out a very interesting concept described by Nietzsche. Originally, it's, in French, it's the ressentiment, and that's the word that Nietzsche used, which can be explained by a resentment of others, yeah, based on wounded pride and a desire to exact revenge. Yeah? So can you elaborate on this and explain to us how you see this as a motive behind Donald Trump's attitude and decisions?
Well, thank you very much. That's a great question to start off with, because I think that today's politics is better understood in these psychological terms rather than in terms of economic interests or power politics. Well, power politics is, of course, important, but it's driven, I think, by a kind of psychology. I think one of the general characteristics of all populist movements is really ressentiment, this idea that I have not received the kind of respect that I deserve. I think that that drives Donald Trump. He was an outsider. He was a developer from the Queens. He wasn't accepted by high society in New York, and he resented that terribly. He wasn't taken seriously by Barack Obama, who made fun of him at a famous White House Correspondents' dinner. And I think it explains a lot of the weird things that he's done. For example, he wants to take control of the National Symphony and the arts and this sort of thing.
Kennedy Center.
Yeah, Kennedy Center. And I think that he wants to show those cultural elites that now he's in charge.
So it's social resentment?
Social resentment, and then I think that his brilliance lay in the fact that he understood that many ordinary people also feel disrespected. I think the big divide in the world today is between educated people that live in big cities and have a lot of opportunities, and then people that live in smaller towns and villages, and they feel that they have not been part of the world that's been created by those elites. And Trump, he sees many of them, they go to his casinos, and I think he understands their feelings of disrespect, and that's what he's brilliantly capitalized on, and I think that's really driving that. I think that's true in this country as well.
Is this, does this remind you of the deplorable, the word used by Hillary Clinton? Is that what you mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, I mean, this is really, another mark that she and other liberal elites managed to accumulate over time, that they looked down on people that were not like themselves, that weren't well-educated, hadn't gone to Ivy League universities. What's going on in the United States, I think, is really stupid right now. There's this big attack on Harvard University and all these elite universities that are really at the core of the American project, higher education, research in the sciences. Why would anyone want to attack that? And I think you have to explain that not in terms of economics, because it makes no economic sense. It's a resentment.
Yeah. So it's a kind of rage against the intellectual elites and cultural elites, right? Not against economic elites.
Well, there's resentment against economic elites as well. The CEO of a big healthcare company was assassinated by this guy, Mangione, and it's amazing how many people responded to that positively because they also resent, the way that health insurance companies have been treating them. And so I do think that that kind of ressentiment also exists.
So do you see this do you see a common feature there in this ressentiment also among other populist leaders abroad, like Javier Milei in Argentina, or our European populist leaders, Orban? Do you think it's the same factor? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure that someone like Orban was really an outsider. He was central to the democratic movement in Hungary, but certainly his support does not come from educated people in Budapest. It comes from the countryside, from other parts of Hungary. I think it also explains a lot of Putin, because Putin intensely resented the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fact that Russia was no longer seen as a great power. Obama at one point called Russia a regional power, and he hated that. And I think he's been trying to prove that Russia has to be respected as it was when it was the Soviet Union.
I think he also had this some humiliating experiences during his childhood. So let's stick to psychology for a moment. You also mentioned this timos concept, which is a Greek word and which expresses, in fact, a desire for recognition. And we also have in this range megalothymia, which is a desire for domination. And this was also described by Nietzsche as in his the power, the will of power, and which is supposed to be the essence of the human being. So do you see this as well in Donald Trump, this desire of domination, this megalothymia? Do you think it's there too?
I think that it's definitely there. In fact, it defines his personality in many ways. And the lack of respect and the will to dominate are related to each other, because that intense insecurity that comes from people not respecting you then leads you to want to get revenge, and you want to show them that you're actually the most powerful person in the society. And I think that that's really what's been driving him. He can't stand losing. That's absolutely the worst thing, and it doesn't matter, justice, democracy, any values are much less important than the simple fact of winning, and that's defined his career right from the beginning.
So let's go back to political science and what's going on in the United States at the moment. So how would you qualify the United States today, the political regime? Is this a democracy? Is this an elected authoritarian regime? Is this an illiberal democracy as we've had here in Europe? Is it a rogue state? I mean, what is your description at this stage?
Well, I think it's moving towards a kind of electoral autocracy. What's remarkable about Trump in his first 100 days is that even though the Republicans control both the House and the Senate, he's not getting legislation. He's simply issuing executive orders. He wants to be a king, not an elected democratic leader. And I think, that's the way he ran his family business, and that's the way he would really like to run the United States. And that's why he admires people like Putin and Xi, because as authoritarian leaders, they don't have to ask anybody's permission to do things. And so I think that we're in the midst, really, of a big constitutional crisis, because he's being told by the courts that he cannot simply ship somebody off to El Salvador with no due process.
But he ignores the courts.
Well, he's ignored the lower courts, and the big question is, sooner or later, it's going to come before the Supreme Court. And I think that even this conservative Supreme Court is going to tell him he can't do certain things. The case that's going to come up first is about birthright citizenship, whether you can deny citizenship to somebody legally born in the United States, and he wants to overturn that. And even this conservative court, I don't think is going to support that. And then the question will be, Is he just going to ignore the Supreme Court, or is he going to submit? And that's a test that we're going to...
That's the ultimate test.
Yeah.
Yeah. And were you surprised? I mean, we all know now that Trump 1 was not as dangerous as Trump 2. I think most commentators have pointed out how surprised they were at the speed of Trump 2, of action of Trump 2. Were you surprised yourself by the lack of resistance, in fact, those famous checks and balances that we keep celebrating when you talk about democracy, American democracy and so on, that those checks and balances were not that strong in the end? I mean, was this something which surprised you?
It's disappointed me. I think that's been true of a whole series of American institutions. So you saw that Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg all went to the inauguration. They offered Trump tribute, basically, millions of dollars in contributions. Lawyers, the big firms, have been submitting to Trump's diktat for having represented his enemies. The press, it's really ridiculous. You know, these big press organizations have been censoring themselves. They don't have to wait for Trump to tell them not to say certain things. They're going to do it on their own.
You mean TV, newspapers?
Yeah, and my university, I mean, I think that, you know, Harvard finally stood up to Trump, but my university refused to sign a statement supporting Harvard. And I think that this has been the weakness of our institutions. There hasn't been collective action. I think that if all of these organizations had agreed right from the beginning that they were not going to submit to this kind of diktat, then it would have been effective. But they're really being picked off one by one.
Yeah, because we can see, in fact, that when Trump encounters strong resistance, he blinks, yeah?
Yeah. And we're seeing that now with the tariffs. I mean,
right.
I think that that's actually something that he can't spin as he'd like to, because that's really going to hurt ordinary consumers. And that's the one thing I think that I'm hopeful will force him to back down. And he's already backed down. If you look at the relationship with China, Chinese said we're not going to accept this, and basically he gave in. He's the one that lowered.
Yeah. But it takes a foreign leader. So what's going on inside? I mean, what is the Democratic Party doing?
Well, unfortunately, they're just licking their wounds and trying to figure out which direction to go. And I'm afraid right now most of the energy in the Democratic Party is on the progressive side. It's AOC and Bernie Sanders in the left wing of the party. My own view right from the beginning was the party needed to move to the center on a lot of different issues. So I can advertise for this abundance movement that Ezra Klein and a number of other people have been pushing, where the argument basically is there is something fundamentally broken about American liberalism. We have created so many rules and constraints on the government that we can't build anything. So you might be aware that California has been trying to build a high-speed rail now for years and years, and it's not happened. Because it's just too difficult to do things. And I think that if a Democratic politician acknowledged that and said, we really need to cut through all the red tape and deregulate certain things, I think that that would be a winning formula. But I don't see at this point, I don't see anyone moving in that direction.
That's a very important point, because you have created this program, Reforms for Results, And can you tell us a little bit about this? Because this is a very important criticism which is pointed at democracies. It's that they don't deliver. The Chinese deliver. The Chinese party delivers. But there's this famous cliche about if you want to build a bridge in California, it takes years, and if you want to build a bridge in China, it takes 2 months, right? So. That's a very important issue.
Yeah, I think that it's true in all liberal democracies. The liberal part of liberal democracy means the rule of law. And people on the left have generally seen legitimacy lying in more and more rules and procedures. And democracy is all about following procedures. But at a certain point, that becomes an obstacle to actually doing things, making decisions, you know, getting security for your citizens, getting bridges built and this sort of thing. So I think that there needs to be an adjustment where we realize that this accumulation of rules is actually breeding the opposite. It's breeding people like Elon Musk who don't want to follow any rules whatsoever and just do whatever they want, or Donald Trump. And I think we need something in the middle.
I think this is also a warning for us in Europe, because there's a lot of criticism at at the European Union production of norms and norms and norms, accumulation of norms, which is making the life of businesses quite difficult. But I hope we don't have to get to that point. Let's go back to geopolitics, maybe, and since we were talking about psychology and political science, we have an amazing spectacle going on today in Istanbul. And it's all about a war. It's a very important war. It's an enormous security challenge. It's a humanitarian disaster in the heart of Europe. And then we have this kind of theater in Istanbul today where Zelensky said he was coming, you know, all these leaders challenging each other through social media. Putin not saying, you know, keeping his cards to his chest, not saying whether he would come. He never said that he would come, and he never said he would not come, but he's not there. He has this, he's sending this team. Trump saying, I may come, and finally. So what do you make of this? Is there any chance that something useful can come out of this, or is it, yeah?
I think that there's one explanation for this outcome, and that is Vladimir Putin. It is Putin's fault. Putin miscalculated. He thought that once Donald Trump was elected, he could get whatever he wanted from the Ukrainians, because Donald Trump would force them to accept peace on his terms. And it turned out that that's not happened. The Ukrainians have resisted that. Trump himself seems to be a little bit more annoyed with Putin because he also thought that he could force the Ukrainians to accept Putin's terms. Putin has not offered to give up anything. He's not made a single concession towards, you know, what would be a reasonable. Well, first of all, Ukrainians will never agree to a peace settlement if that means formally giving up sovereignty over Crimea and the other occupied territories. You could get a ceasefire, which would be temporary, but then could, you know, it could actually get to you know, a stopping of the war. But the Russians have to accept that, and they have to accept the fact that they're not going to be able to claim all of the territory that they conquered. They're not going to be able to demand that Ukraine never get any security guarantees from anybody else. So I think Putin is overplaying his hand.
He's cornered, you think? He's cornered?
Yeah, but it's unfortunately going to take a continuation of the war. The Russian position is not that strong. I think in the short run, he's confident that he can keep the war going, but their economy is not doing well, and it can't be on this permanent war footing. And so I'm afraid it's just going to drag on for the time being.
But so a lot depends on Putin, of course, but also a lot depends on Donald Trump, because do we know which way he's going?
Yeah. Well, I think Trump miscalculated also. You remember that he said that he would end the war in 24 hours, and it's been a little bit more than 24 hours now. I think that he himself has realized that he can't simply dictate terms to the Ukrainians either. And with Europe's support, you know, he really doesn't have the leverage to do that. So, you know, in a way, Europe has injected itself into this in what I think is a useful way, especially your country, Poland. So I really appreciate the support that all of you have given to Ukraine. That's extremely important, and I think it... you know, maybe I should just say this at this point. I visited this country for the first time in July 1989, right after the Polish Roundtable. And I remember at that time the incredible hopes that people had for Poland becoming a democracy, and I think that Poland has succeeded beyond my expectation and everybody else's. So I would like to congratulate you as a country.
This is very true. This July 1989 was not only after the Round Table, it was after the first election.
That's right.
On June 4. And we always talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall, but for me, the fall of communism started here on June 4.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it so happened that it was the day of Tiananmen Square massacre also, so this was a very eventful day for the world. But since that's a very good transition, because when we were talking about this summit or not so summit in Istanbul, I was thinking also of the summit Reagan-Gorbachev in 1986, which was in a way the beginning of the end of the Cold War, right? And so this is a completely different world we're in now, with leaders behaving completely differently. And so what did we miss? At what point did you see this going the wrong way, or was it really a gradual process?
Well, it was gradual. It really began, I think, at the time of the big financial crisis in 2008, because I think that was the peak of American power and hegemony. And the financial crisis, I think, revealed a big weakness in this American free market model. And that contributed to the lack of prestige that had really been triggered by the Iraq invasion, where American foreign policy also looked like it was overstepping and going too far.
And dragging these countries with it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I think ever since then, there has been a weakening of the prestige of both the American political model and the American economic model. And so it's been gradual in that sense, and that has triggered internal social changes. I actually think that generational turnover is important. So my generation, I would say that what I experienced here in Poland in 1989 was the biggest event of my life. Yeah. Right, the transition of this entire region to democracy.
I totally agree.
But, for younger people, they grow up in a democracy and they assume that it's always going to be there.
And it's not always going to be there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it breeds complacency and the assumption that you don't really have to struggle very hard to keep your democracy.
But, so what, is it only complacency, or was it, how responsible is America for this? Because we talk about, at the moment we talk about the transatlantic relationship and as something which has always been great, and suddenly it's broken. Minister Sikorski yesterday said, it's like a marriage and the husband or the wife is having affairs. Isn't this more serious than this? How bad is this?
Yeah, I'm afraid that the United States is never going to go back to the country that it was in before 2016, because there's a core of maybe a third of American voters that are really extremely angry and very supportive of this extreme right-wing position. They're not a majority, so the United States can still get back to acting responsibly, but given our electoral system, it means that this group is going to prevent the United States from returning to this internationalist position that it once held. One of the reasons for that is, in fact, the overreach in the early 2000s. The Iraq War, Afghanistan, both contributed to this feeling that the United States had no business sending forces into these distant theaters where they were not leading to successful results. So I think that kind of more isolationist posture is going to be permanent. Obama really began that in a way. But the question is, do you completely abandon your international responsibilities, and especially on the economic front, do you suddenly declare that every country in the world is your enemy? I think that that's not a sustainable position, and hopefully this is something that we're going to be able to recover from.
And so for Europe, because this is pushing a dynamic of strengthening Europe, not necessarily the European Union. We see there are different formats taking shape to try to answer the current challenges. But obviously there's a push towards more strength for the European project. Is this compatible with American power?
Oh, no, it's absolutely compatible. So American presidents, every single American president has said that Europe should do more to defend itself.
Yes, but always with strings attached.
With strings attached, but, Europeans could have done more. And the one useful thing I think that Donald Trump did in his first term is make the credible threat that we're going to actually cut back our contribution if you don't do more. And in fact, most European countries began to increase their defense spending. Right now, I just think that that's the top priority for Europe. You have to invest more in your defense industrial base, in your military capabilities. I think that Germany is the country that really has to lead the way, together with France. I just don't see any alternative for Europe at the present moment, because they're not going to go back to the old situation where the United States could really backstop European security.
So it's interesting you say France and Germany have to lead the way, but what about this country, which is spending so much on defense? Is it spending just for itself, or is it spending it also for other Europeans?
Well, look, it's a collective activity, and one of the things that's happened is that the balance of power within Europe has shifted. So it was always just about France and Germany previously, but I think that Eastern Europe, led by Poland, is really now playing a much more important leadership role, and I think that that's a very positive development for Europe as a whole, because this country is much more exposed to Russian power. I think people in this part of Europe understand the nature of the threat much better, and I think that leads to a very well-deserved leadership role.
And another thing about Poland is that it's one of very few countries which managed to overcome 8 years, a government, a populist government. So, what do you see any lessons for the US to draw from the Polish experience?
No, absolutely. So, I'm frequently asked by people, what do we do to resist the anti-democratic wave of populism? And I just have one answer to that, which is go vote. If you live in a country that still has...
Well, it happens that there's an election on Sunday, so...
Yeah. No, I think that that's absolutely the way. I do think that Poland showed that this is not an inevitable tide that's going to overwhelm everybody, and I think every other country needs to draw a lesson from that, including the United States. So we're going to have a midterm election, which is going to be a referendum on the first 2 years of Donald Trump, and that's going to be the first big opportunity to say, okay, enough, this is not the kind of country that we want.
Okay, well, I think on that note, that's very good advice from Poland to American voters. Thank you very, very much, Professor Fukuyama. I think you're coming back, so there's more to come. Thank you.